So some of you may have come prepared this morning to read the whole of Malachi. We're just going to do one verse. But maybe you haven't been here and you've actually missed out on Malachi. It's not the easiest book to read because it's a book about really our hearts and our distance from God. The word of God to Israel when they've gone astray, when they followed after their own ways. Malachi 1 verse 2, God turns around and he opens up the book through the prophet Malachi and he turns around and he says, I've loved you. I mean, God's turning around to all of us and saying, I loved you. And then he turns around in the book and he says, you loved me back with blemished offerings. You've lacked in your honor of worship of God. In Malachi 2 verse 10, he turns around and says, I am your father, I am your creator. And yet you spiritually prostitute yourself with idols. Keep on going to the things of the world, looking for meaning, looking for life, looking for covenants. But it's actually with the Father who's designed and made you for his purpose. That our only true meaning is found when we know him. We receive that grace. Malachi 3, we started in the beginning last week, where he turns around and he says, come back. Fire and refining. Remember, if you were here last week, we spoke about that God says, I'm going to come like a lavender soap, like a refining, like a silversmith. And he talks about the tests and the trials that we all go through and that there's purpose behind those things. That he comes in and he cleans us in a way that this world will never be able to. He makes our wrongs right. And these are prophetic words about the cross that was coming 400 years after it was written. And he says, I'm also going to refine you. That refining we don't like. No one in the church likes refining, eh? No one. Because why? You get put into the fire and it burns up so that all the rubbish, the things of this world can come to the top so you can scrape them off. And as I shared last week, how does the silversmith or the goldsmith know when you've been refined enough? It says when they can see their image in what's left. That's what God does. But I want to share one verse this morning and just a part. Malachi 3 verse 6. This is a line that really stood out in this chapter. Turns around and says, I, the Lord, do not change. So you, the descendants of Jacob, are not destroyed. I, the Lord, do not change. So you, the descendants of do not change. So you, the descendants of Jacob, are not destroyed. Remember the first time I ever heard this word, if you can go to the next slide, saying, thanks Josh, let me just grab my clicker. I'm just changing things up a bit this morning. No, one back there. First time I ever saw this verse and the line was this word immutability. Now, I grew up in a generation, we had Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, okay? So that's what the pastor said, immutability, and that was me gone for the rest of the sermon. I'm like, what is he talking about, immutability? We live in this changing world where things adapt. I'm doing maths with my kids, and I really have no idea half the time what I'm doing, okay? Lots has changed in the last number of years, even within maths. Pluto has lost its status as a planet, if you haven't realized and haven't kept up to the trends, okay? I don't know what it is now. A moon. I don't know what it is, but it's just something, okay? It's no longer one of the planets, so we only have, how many planets do we have? 8 now. We don't have 9 anymore, okay? Worldwide pandemics, we always thought were science fiction. We've lived through one. Things have changed. I always tell us when I do with marriage counseling with couples, I say the person you marry today is not going to be the person you're going to be with in 5 years' time. They're going to be different. Why? Because we change. The things that you like. Think back to 15 years ago. What were your priorities and your goals 15 years ago? Okay, some of you, maybe it was, not pooping in your nappy, but what were your goals? Eh? Think about how things have changed, even within yourself. Tastes change, goals change, priorities change, things change. In the midst of all of this, God turns around and says, I'm immutable. In other words, I do not change. I love the second part of it, so that you are not destroyed. And he's writing to a nation, to Israel, he kept on going against him. And I want to just say this morning that we have a God who does not give up on us. He does not give up on you. David came and he spoke to me. He just said, I just get the sense, those words, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, where Jesus cries out, my God, why are you forsaken me? And he just had that. There's some of us here, or somebody here is just feeling like God has left them. Let me tell you now, I, the Lord, do not change. So you are not destroyed. That is one of our greatest hopes. It's the hope of the church, not that we are perfect people, but that we are imperfect people being made perfect daily, and one day we will be complete and perfect. And that is when we're with Him. But it's continual chipping away. It's continually scraping up and burning off the stuff of our lives. So God turns around to Israel and says, I am not moved. I am steadfast. In fact, He turns around. I love this verse. And when I first read this verse, I am not moved. Okay? I do not change. Kind of thought, okay, here's this rigid standard. Do you know what really God is saying here when you read in the context of this passage? He turns to Israel and says, do you know what? I am not moved by your wrongdoing. You deserve destruction. So why hasn't it happened? Why is the world around us not destroyed if God is righteous? You know why? Because of Jesus. Because of Jesus. And this seems to be coming up time and time again. We need to understand that everything in the Old Testament and the New Testament always comes back to the cross of Christ. A covenant was formed in blood. Blood was shed, and that was Jesus. I've shared this time and time. We've got to get our idea and our thinking of who God is right from the very beginning. In the Garden of Genesis, we see that God introduces sacrifice, the shedding of blood to cover shame, to cover our wrongdoing, even when we were the ones that did wrong. We don't realize this. We actually miss it in Genesis, right? When Adam and Eve choose to not surrender to God and go their own way, what does God come along and do? It says before they get banished from the Garden of Eden, He covers their shame with what? It says with animal skins. I know most of the pictures have got leaves, okay? Strategically placed leaves. But it's animal skins. And do you know what the reality is when you look into that story? God went and took what He created and He sacrificed it so that their shame could be covered before they were banished, sent out. Why does God not leave you to your own destruction? Because Jesus laid down His life. You see, we have a God who does not give up on you. Never. As David said those words this morning, my God, why have you forsaken me? I wrote these words a few days. Some of you believe that God has given up on you. Some believe that what you have done is not redeemable. Some of you believe that what you are is not worth it. That we do not even have enough worth to offer anything to God. It reminded me this morning when David said those words to me, and he reminded me that it's not about our worth. It's about who He is. And that His love for us is what gives us our foundation, gives us our hope. Some of you feel as if God has left you, and God turns around and says, I have not left you, I do not change. Even when it feels like you're in a fire, and you may be in the fire, that refining, that process. So the Lord turns around Malachi through the prophet Malachi to His people, and He says, I do not change. I haven't left you. Even though you've gone your own way, even though you've chosen time and time again. It reminds me that God is fully committed to us. He does not give up. Adam and Eve, they choose their own way over surrender. That's the way I always look at the story in Genesis. Do not eat. There's 2 trees in the Garden of Eden that God had planted in the middle, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of life. And He says, do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, surrender your lives to me. Live in community with me. And they do. They choose their own way, and with it, they choose over the presence of God and to be with God. And so they're banished. And do you know why they're banished? So that they do not have claim to the tree of life. Why? Because the only person that can give life is God. He's the only one that gives us true life and true hope. God is the giver of life. We see that they're banished. And when I was busy studying theology, we always talk about holiness, the holiness of God. And it's so scary, the holiness of God. Isaiah has this image in Isaiah 6, and he says, your robe filled the temple. And there's all these different images of the holiness. And that robe, the greater the king was, the longer his robe. That was how it worked. The more power you had, the longer your robe that flowed out behind you. And it says that his robe filled the temple. His power was beyond comprehension. The wrath of God was beyond even thought. God was all powerful, and he can have nothing that is sinful before him. In fact, to be holy is to be set apart. It's to be separated, that there cannot be any bad in front of good. There can only be good. Our theological view is that God cannot have sin before him. But I've also learned this, that God doesn't care about our theological views a lot of the time. He breaks our theological boxes. And so here, Adam and Eve do one of the greatest things. They turn their backs on God. They choose to go their own way because they believe, they side with Satan. Remember, Satan says to him, did God really say that you must not eat? Brings doubt. Turns around and says, but I tell you, in other words, he wants their trust in him. He wants them to surrender to his authority and his word. And he says, but I tell you, you will not die. You will be like God. And he appeals to what every single one of us wants. To make our own decisions, be the own ones of our fate, to control everything around us. That's what Satan lures them with. So they choose. And what happens is God covers their shame, but there's also consequences for their shame. There's consequences for their wrongdoing. And so they are told to go out. So why? So they do not have access to the tree of life. Because God is the only one from whom life comes. And so he banishes them and he closes off the Garden of Eden, as the story tells. Now, according to our theological terms, you know what should happen there? That should be the end of the story. That should be the only part of the Bible we have. A God who is perfect and a people who are sinful and have chosen to go their own way. End of story. All guilty, all deserving punishment, all going our own way. This is where our theology really gets messed up, because you open the next chapter and there God is speaking to Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel. People who are the descendants of those who had been banished. They always speak when you study theology and you look at the Bible, they say that the Great Commission, Julian, where are you? The Great Commission, the mission to go out into all the world, preach the word. They always say it starts in Genesis 12. Okay? There's this great story because God goes to Abraham and I'm going to set you apart and make your people for my own doing. No. I believe that the Great Commission starts right from the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve are banished from them, we see that God is on a mission to redeem and bring back those who are far from him. And so here we have a righteous God who has no sin before him. And what he's doing, he's speaking to two sinful people, Cain and Abel, who have no form of redemption. And God has got a plan, and he breaks his own rules to come down to them. He's been on a mission. I, the Lord, do not change, so that you are not destroyed. Some of us need to hold those words together here today. God does not give up on you in your wrongdoing. But, there's always a but, he calls us out of darkness into light. I do not change. We've probably heard this story before, but there's once plowing through a night, a rough, foggy seas, a battleship's radar suddenly indicated an object directly in front of its path. The ship's captain sends out a radio signal. We're on a collision course. Advise you change course 10 degrees north. Short while later, the radio crackles into life. The person on the other side says, recommend you divert your course 10 degrees south to avoid a collision. Captain thinks about this and he goes on. He says, this is the captain of a U.S. Navy ship. I say again, divert your course 10 degrees north. The response on the other side is, I'm a seaman second class, and I advise you that you change your course 10 degrees south to avoid imminent collision. Eventually, the captain shouts over the radio, "This is the aircraft carrier USS Lincoln, the second largest ship in the United States Atlantic Fleet. We're accompanied by 3 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and numerous support vehicles. I demand you change your course 10 degrees north, or countermeasures will be undertaken to ensure the safety of the ship." Immediately, the response comes back, "This is a lighthouse, mate. It's your call." God does not change when it comes to our wrongdoing, but doesn't mean that he changes what he requires to, to make right our wrongdoing. I do not change so you are not destroyed. He goes that no matter what you do, you will never be far enough away from him. But it doesn't mean that he compromises what he requires to bring you into his presence. In Malachi 3 verse 7, it says, "Even since the time of your ancestors, you've turned away from our decrees and have not kept them." He realizes that this is part of who we are. But it doesn't mean that he changes what he requires to cover our wrongdoing. Our sin is still the same. Whether it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, the consequences are still the same. He doesn't change his requirements of holiness because the world around us demands it. He uses these words, "Ever since the time of your ancestors, ever since the time of your forefathers, you have turned away." Some people have often asked me, what is the curse? What is a generational curse? Too often we are the ones that start generational curses. And I'm going to term it like this. We live in such a way that we don't bring people to God. We live our own desires and our own ways. And do not our children and generations beyond us follow that? Time and time again, you see that through the Old Testament, where people follow after sin. Our very example becomes the very yoke upon which the future generations follow. Because we are the ones that live in such a way that doesn't seek after God, doesn't draw people to God. As I said, I'm going to be short this morning, and I, the Lord, do not change, so that you, the descendants of Jacob, are not destroyed. I'm going to remind us this morning in Malachi that our God is always there, even when we have gone our own way. But it doesn't mean that we can just go our own way as much as we want and do what we want and live because he's just going to forgive me. That's grace. No, he holds us to a standard so that you are not destroyed. He comes to us and he puts us into those fires and he says, "This, which is not of my spirit and it's not of my word, I'm going to burn it out. I'm going to refine you so that the Lord's image is shining through you." We have a God which is immutable. He doesn't change because we have gone our own way. And he doesn't change his rules, his life and hope of his scripture. He doesn't change those things because culture changes. Because he knows that he is the only one that can give life, and it's according to his standard. So he calls us to bow our knee, to honor our hearts to him. And I want to do that this morning. I want us to just bow our heads and close our eyes. When have you felt that God has abandoned you? You don't have to put up your hands. I'm just asking that as a question for you before God right now. Are you upset with God? Are you angry with him? Maybe you feel forgotten by him. relationships which have been destroyed, a future which you thought you had, someone who's been taken away. What is that thing between you and God? So I would love you to hear those words, I do not change. I haven't left you. Maybe you're sitting here this morning, you're going, if only you knew. If only you knew what I've done, what I think, how I've acted, what I've said. God says you are not destroyed. God knows that for every single one of us there is hope, afresh, new, and every single day. Just like Adam and Eve turned their back, chose their own way, and suffered the consequences, banishment from God's presence. God makes a way for us to enjoy His presence again, to be refined. And so it's really simple this morning. Lord, we come before you. We ask for that restoration. Lord, I pray that you forgive me for my wrongdoing. Forgive me for the times where I choose the things of this world above you. Lord, I thank you that I am not destroyed when I deserve to be destroyed, but by your grace, you have spared my life today so that I may know you. Lord, forgive me. You do not change. Lord, forgive me today for my choices against you.